The mop bucket hit the bathroom floor with a hollow slap that echoed off the tiles, and Elena Reyes told herself for the 432nd time that this was temporary. She had counted. That was what happened when you had too much silence and not enough sleep. You counted things. Mop strokes. Steps from the elevator to the supply closet. Days since the last time someone had asked how she was doing and meant it. The bathroom on the 14th floor of the Keystone Financial Building in Knoxville smelled like air freshener and other people's waste. And Elena worked through it with the same mechanical efficiency she brought to everything now. Strip the paper liners from the cans, wipe the counters, scrub the bowls, refill the soap, clock out at 5:47 in the morning and catch the 6:02 bus before the first wave of suits started arriving for their 7 o'clock meetings. She was 33 years old, and her knees sounded like someone crumpling a paper bag whenever she crouched down. Her hands were raw from the chemicals, the skin cracking along the knuckles no matter how much drugstore lotion she pressed into them before bed. Her lower back had developed a particular kind of ache that lived in the deep tissue, something that was not quite pain, but was never quite comfortable either, and a permanent reminder of the 40 pounds of equipment she hauled up and down service elevators before the rest of the city was awake. This was the first job, the one that started at 4 in the morning. The second job started at 9 at the fulfillment center off Route 7, where Elena stood at a packing station for 6 hours, scanning barcodes and sealing boxes destined for people who could afford to order things from their phones instead of going to get them. The fluorescent lights at the fulfillment center were the kind that gave you a headache by noon, and the floor was concrete under rubber mats that had long since compressed into something barely softer than the concrete itself. The third job was weekends at a diner on Magnolia Avenue, where she refilled coffee and carried plates and smiled at people who snapped their fingers to get her attention, as though she were something installed in the room rather than a person who had been on her feet for 8 hours before walking through the door. 3 jobs, 1 daughter, 1 apartment with walls thin enough that she could hear the couple next door argue every Tuesday night with the same predictable escalation, like a show she hadn't subscribed to but couldn't cancel, on $870 a month for the apartment. That was rent. Then utilities, which ran between $190 and $240 depending on the season, and in August in East Tennessee the season was always cruel. Groceries for 2, carefully managed, store brands, and whatever was on clearance, never fresh fish, never the good cheese. A treat every week for Clara that rotated between a candy bar and a small container of strawberries. Clara's school lunch account, which needed $12 every Monday to cover the week. The bus pass, $48. The prepaid phone plan, $35. And always, underneath everything, the quiet arithmetic of how much month was left after the money was gone. Clara was 8 years old. She was the kind of child who made everything harder and everything worth it simultaneously. The kind of child who asked questions Elena didn't have answers to and accepted the lack of answers with a grace that seemed too large for someone her size. She had her father's eyes, dark brown and liquid, and capable of expressing about 15 different emotions at once, and she had Elena's stubbornness, which showed up as a set jaw and a certain quality of silence when she had decided something but wasn't ready to say it yet. Clara's father, Marco, had left when Clara was 18 months old. Not dramatically. Not with a fight or a door slamming or any of the moments that movies prepared you for. He had simply moved his things out over a weekend while Elena was working, left a note that said he was sorry and that he just couldn't do this, and was gone before she returned. He sent money for the first 2 years, sporadic and insufficient, and then nothing. His phone was disconnected. His mother, when Elena called the one time, said she didn't know where he was either. And the way she said it made Elena believe her. So Elena had done it alone. Every school pickup, every sick night, every moment when the math didn't work. And she sat at the kitchen table with her calculator and her overdue notices and tried to figure out how to make $50 stretch across a gap that needed $100. She had done it with a ferocity that people sometimes confused for hardness, but was actually something closer to love with nowhere else to go. The alarm on her phone went off at 3:48 in the morning. She had been lying awake for 20 minutes already, running the numbers. Rent was due in 9 days. The current balance in her checking account was $412, and the direct deposit from the janitorial service wouldn't hit until Friday, which was 6 days away. Between now and Friday, she needed to buy groceries, put money on the bus pass, and somehow come up with the school field trip permission slip that Clara had left on the counter 3 weeks ago. $25. The field trip was to a science museum, and the form was still sitting there because $25 wasn't a small number when you were $412 from zero. She slid out of bed carefully. Clara slept in the second bedroom, which was barely large enough for the twin mattress and the plastic dresser they had found at a garage sale 2 summers ago. But it was hers, and she had covered the walls with drawings and the one framed photograph Elena had printed at the drugstore for $3.99. The photo was of the two of them at Riverside Park last spring, squinting into the sun, Clara missing her left front tooth, both of them laughing at something Elena couldn't even remember now. She made coffee with the store-brand grounds that were one step above undrinkable, but were 40 cents cheaper than the next tier up. She pulled on her work clothes in the dark and laced her shoes and went out into the Knoxville pre-dawn with the specific weariness of someone who knew exactly how many hours were between now and the next time she could sit down. The janitorial company's van picked her up at the corner at 4:07. The driver was a man named Harold, who had worked this route for 11 years and communicated primarily through an economy of nods. There were 3 others in the van, all women, all with the same particular posture of people who have learned to conserve energy across the entire architecture of their lives. The Keystone Financial Building was 32 floors of glass and steel, and Elena's crew handled floors 12 through 18. She worked methodically and quickly, her hands knowing the routine better than her brain needed to direct it, and let her mind go to whatever halfway place it went to in the early mornings, not quite thinking, not quite not thinking. It was on the 14th floor bathroom that she saw the notice taped to the inside of the stall door. Not for her. For whoever used this bathroom during the day, and the women in the good suits who arrived at 7 and left at 6, and had the particular confidence of people who have never had to think carefully about whether to spend $25. The notice was from the building management about an upcoming renovation, and it described what the renovated bathrooms would include, with photographs, marble counters, heated floors, automated fixtures. And Elena stood there with her mop for a moment and thought about the thing she was careful not to think about too often, which was what it might feel like to work in a building like this instead of cleaning it. She pushed the thought back down where it lived, finished the 14th floor, and moved to the 15th. The fulfillment center supervisor's name was Darnell Price. He was 26 years old and had been promoted 8 months ago from the floor to supervisor, a transition that had given him a new badge and a new posture and an apparent need to assert both. He walked the floor with his clipboard the way some people carry weapons, and he had a particular talent for delivering small humiliations in front of an audience, the kind that you couldn't call out directly without sounding oversensitive, but that accumulated in the body like low-grade poison. Elena had worked for Darnell for 3 months. She had learned to keep her head down and her pace up, and to make herself unremarkable, which she was largely successful at until the Wednesday morning in October, when she got to her packing station 2 minutes late, because the bus had run behind schedule. The floor was already running, conveyor belts moving, scanners beeping, the constant industrial hum of the place that you stopped hearing after the first hour, but that was always there. Elena clocked in and moved to her station and was pulling on her scanner glove when Darnell appeared at her shoulder with his clipboard and the expression he wore when he had decided someone needed to understand something. "You're late." He said it at a volume that carried to the 6 nearest stations. The bus ran behind. "I'm sorry." She kept her voice level, her eyes on her station setup. "It won't happen again." "Third time this month." It was the second time. Elena knew this precisely, and the way she knew all the numbers in her life precisely, because imprecision was a luxury she couldn't afford. But she also knew that correcting Darnell in front of 6 coworkers would cost more than the correction was worth. "I understand," she said. Darnell stayed at her shoulder. He had the unhurried quality of someone who knew she couldn't leave. "I heard you asked Janelle about the shift lead opening." Janelle was the HR coordinator. The shift lead opening had been posted for 2 weeks, and it paid $4 more an hour, which over a 30-hour week was an extra $120, which was the grocery gap, the field trip, the breathing room. Elena had submitted her application through the employee portal and had not mentioned it to Darnell. "I did apply, yes," she said. Darnell's laugh had the quality of something that knew it could afford to be careless. "You're a packer, Reyes. You've been here what, 3 months? 4? Shift lead requires 18 months minimum. Did you read the job description?" "I met the minimum qualifications listed." "On paper, maybe." He glanced around, making sure the nearest people were tracking the conversation. "There's a difference between what you put on a form and what you can actually do. Some people know that. Some people are still figuring it out." He tapped his clipboard. "Let's talk about performance. You're at the 83rd percentile for scan rate. That sounds good." It's not. Top candidates are consistently 95th and above. You want a lead position? You need to be actually good at this job first. Elena's hands had stilled on the scanner. She felt the familiar hot crawl of humiliation across her face, and the equally familiar cold discipline of refusing to let it out. She was the wrong person to humiliate if you wanted visible results. She had learned to take it quietly and convert it into whatever fuel she needed to get through the next hour. I'll focus on improving my numbers," she said. "Good." He leaned slightly closer, dropping his voice just enough that it required effort to hear, which meant the nearest people had to lean in slightly. "Between us, though, the lead position is looking for someone with more, I don't know, stability. You've got a lot going on. 3 jobs, single-parent situation. Leads need to be reliably present, consistent, someone the team can count on." He straightened up. "Just giving you honest feedback." Someone at the next station was looking studiously at their screen. Another was adjusting their glove with great concentration. Elena turned back to her station, picked up her scanner, and started working. She did not respond to Darnell. She did not look at the people who had heard. She scanned the first box, sealed it, put it on the belt, scanned the next one, and let the work absorb the heat in her chest, the way work had always absorbed things she could not afford to feel fully. She clocked out at 3:15 and caught the bus home with 45 minutes before she needed to pick up Clara from aftercare. She sat in the 3rd row with her eyes closed and did not sleep and did not open them until her stop. The apartment smelled like the tomato soup she had left in the slow cooker, and the smell of it hit her with a tenderness so sudden it almost undid all the composure she had held together across the day. She had started the soup at 3:30 in the morning before leaving for the van pickup, cutting the onion and the garlic in the dark kitchen with the specific, careful quietness of someone not wanting to wake a child. The soup was cheap and filling, and Clara liked it. That was enough. She changed her shoes, picked up Clara, heated the soup, to listen to Clara tell her about the science experiment they had done with baking soda and vinegar, and did not think about Darnell Price or the shift lead position, or the $412. She sat at the small kitchen table with her daughter and the steam coming off the bowls, and concentrated on being present in this one thing. Later, after Clara was asleep, Elena sat at the table with her bills arranged in front of her and her calculator, and did the math again, as if the numbers might be different this time. They were not different. She closed her calculator app, laid her phone face down, and stared at the watermark on the ceiling above the table where the upstairs neighbor had an overflowing tub 2 winters ago. The letter arrived the next morning. She almost didn't open it. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, the kind that conveyed a deliberate seriousness, and Elena had learned that letters designed to look important usually were, but not in ways that benefited her. Her first instinct was eviction notice, some escalation from the landlord's management company, who had been sending increasingly formal correspondence about the small mold patch in the second bedroom that Elena had been asking them to fix since June. But the return address was a law firm, Hammond, Greer, and Whitfield, attorneys at law, Harlan, Kentucky. She didn't know anyone in Kentucky. She set the envelope on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then picked up her coffee and made herself drink half of it before opening it. Whatever this was, she wanted to be slightly more awake for it. The letterhead was sober and clean. She read the first paragraph twice before the words resolved into meaning. It was regarding the estate of one James Earl Whitaker, deceased, of Harlan County, Kentucky. The letter informed her that she had been identified as the sole beneficiary under the terms of Mr. Whitaker's last will and testament, for executed July 14th of the previous year and filed with the Harlan County Probate Court. The estate included, among other assets, a parcel of real property located at Rural Route 4, approximately 11 miles outside the town of Benham, Kentucky, along with any and all structures situated thereon. The attorney, a man named Douglas Hammond, requested her presence at her earliest convenience to discuss the terms of the bequest and sign the relevant transfer documentation. Elena sat down on the kitchen chair. James Earl Whitaker. She turned the name over, looking for purchase. She had never heard it. She was certain of that. It wasn't a name from her childhood, not a name her mother had ever mentioned. Her mother, Patricia, had died 4 years ago from a stroke, and Elena had thought, in the foggy aftermath of that loss, that she was now unmoored from all connection to the people who had come before her. No fathers on either side who were present, on no aunts or uncles she had stayed in contact with. Nothing that looked like a family history, so much as a series of separations and silences. James Earl Whitaker. Who was he? She read the letter 3 more times, looking for a clue in the formal language, and found nothing except the name and the property, and an attorney in Harlan County, waiting for her signature. Real property. That meant land. Maybe a building. She thought about it the way she always thought about money, with the first instinct being, what does it cost to keep? And the second being, what is it worth to sell? And the third, rising like something she hadn't given herself permission to feel yet, being, what if? She took a photograph of the letter with her phone and Googled Douglas Hammond, Harlan, Kentucky. The firm existed. She found a listing, a basic website, the kind that small-town attorneys used, and a phone number. She called during her break at the fulfillment center, standing in the bathroom stall with the phone pressed close because the floor noise was relentless and she needed to hear. Hammond answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was measured, careful, with the unhurried quality of a man who was used to delivering information of weight and had learned not to rush the delivery. She confirmed her identity. He confirmed the bequest. She asked about James Earl Whitaker. There was a pause. Then Hammond said that he had been instructed by the terms of the will to provide specific documentation at the time of her visit, and that he believed certain things would become clearer when they met in person. What he could tell her now was that Mr. Whitaker had been a resident of Harlan County for most of his adult life, that he had died at the age of 81 without living relatives willing to be found, and that his connection to Elena was something the will and its accompanying documents addressed directly. "What's the property like?" Elena asked. Another pause. "I want to be forthright with you, Ms. Reyes. The structure on the property has seen better days. There was a partial roof collapse several years back, and the building has not been inhabited in some time. The land itself is approximately 4 acres, which has some value, but the structure would require significant work before it could be considered livable." Elena thought about the math. A damaged cabin in rural Kentucky, whatever it appraised at, even in poor condition, it was an asset she did not have. And any asset was better than the $412 she was working with. She made arrangements to take 2 days off unpaid, which she could not afford, but could not afford not to, and told Clara they were going on a trip to Kentucky. Clara, who was 8 and had never been out of Tennessee except once to visit a great aunt in Georgia, received this news with a gravity that broke slightly into excitement. "Is there a house?" she asked. "There's a cabin. It might not be very nice. Can we stay there?" "I don't know yet, baby." Clara considered this. "Maybe it will be like the stories," she said. She had been reading a series of adventure books where children found abandoned houses, and the houses turned out to be important. She had a faith in narrative that Elena was both charmed by and quietly terrified of. Life did not run on the same logic as the adventure books. Elena knew that better than anyone. "Maybe," she said, and meant it less than Clara needed her to. They left on a Thursday morning before dawn. Elena's car, a 2009 Civic with 214,000 miles and a rattle in the passenger door that she had learned to tune out, they're loaded with 1 bag each and the slow cooker because Clara had insisted on bringing soup. The drive from Knoxville to Harlan County was 3 hours through the mountains, the highway climbing and dropping through ridges dressed in the full gold and rust of October. Elena drove and Clara slept against the window, and the radio played quietly, country music bleeding into static as they went deeper into the hills, the signal reaching and retreating. The landscape changed gradually, the soft curves of the Tennessee mountains giving way to something starker and more vertical, a country that felt older somehow, the kind of terrain that made you aware of how long the land had been here before anyone named it. She had told people she was going. That had been a mistake. She had mentioned it to Brianna, one of the women on her janitorial crew, because Brianna had asked why she was taking days off unpaid. And Elena had said she was going to Kentucky to look at a property she had inherited. She had said it simply, because it was simply true. But Brianna had told Harold, and Harold had mentioned it to the crew manager. And somehow, it had also gotten back to the fulfillment center. And on her last shift before leaving, Darnell had appeared at her station with an expression that was performing sympathy while delivering something else entirely. "Heard you're coming into some property," he said. Elena kept scanning. "Just going to look at something a relative left." "Relative you never met?" "That's right." Darnell nodded slowly, the nod of a man who was about to share wisdom he hadn't been asked for. "That happens sometimes. People get letters saying they inherited something, drive all the way out there, and it turns out to be like a leaky shed on a floodplain." He laughed. "Happened to my cousin. Whole county was convinced it was going to be something. Turned out to be a trailer with a lien on it that cost more to deal with than it was worth." Elena said nothing. "What part of Kentucky?" "Harlan County." He made a sound. "That's coal country, middle of nowhere. Whatever you inherited out there, if it's a cabin, you're probably looking at something that's been sitting empty for years. Foundation issues, water damage. That kind of property, half the time you're better off just signing it back over. The taxes alone on a property you can't use will eat you alive." He shrugged. "Just something to think about. Don't want you driving all the way out there and getting your hopes up." She had not told anyone her hopes. She had been careful not to have hopes yet. But Darnell had identified the space where they might have lived and moved to occupy it before she could. "I appreciate the advice," she said. "Just trying to help. You've got enough on your plate already, right? The 3 jobs, the kid. So the last thing you need is to inherit a money pit." He tapped her station counter with his clipboard. "Good luck out there. Hope it's something useful. But be realistic." She drove the rest of the morning to Harlan with Darnell's voice, doing what voices like his did after the conversation ended, circling back with the particular persistence of words that were designed to inhabit. Hammond's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on the main street of Harlan, high up a narrow staircase that smelled like old wood and paper. Hammond himself was 60-something, trim, with silver hair, and reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose. His handshake was brief and professional. He had a folder on his desk that was 2 inches thick. Clara had come inside at Elena's insistence because leaving an 8-year-old in a car in an unfamiliar town was not something she was willing to do, and Clara sat in the extra chair with her backpack on her lap, examining the law office with the frank curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. Hammond opened the folder. He explained that James Earl Whitaker had been born in Harlan County in 1942, that he had worked most of his adult life in regional commerce and investment, and that he had never married and had no children. He had lived alone on his property for the last 30 years, having purchased the land and cabin in 1987, and had been cared for in his final years by a woman from the county who checked on him periodically. Then he said the part that made Elena's throat tighten. James Whitaker, he explained, had been the longtime business partner of Elena's maternal grandfather, Robert Avila, who had died in 1989 before Elena was born. The 2 men had been close for nearly 40 years. Whitaker had known Elena's mother as a child. When Patricia died 4 years ago, Whitaker had been informed, and had made the decision then to revise his will to leave what remained of his estate to Patricia's daughter. He had known Elena only through what her mother had told him, and through the photograph Patricia had carried of the 2 of them. He had left everything to her because there was no one else, and because she was, in his estimation, where the last of something worth passing on should go. Elena looked at the folder on the desk. "He didn't know me. Not personally. I know. He left it to me because of my mother. And because of the connection to your grandfather, yes. Mr. Whitaker was a private man. He left a letter for you." Hammond produced an envelope, cream-colored and sealed with wax. He placed it on the desk in front of her. "He asked that you read it when you arrive at the property, not before. His specific request." She put the letter in her bag. The paperwork took 40 minutes. Hammond was patient and thorough, and he walked her through each page without condescension. The property transfer was straightforward. The cabin and the 4 acres were now hers, free and clear, the taxes paid current. There was also a small bank account, the balance of Whitaker's liquid assets, after all estate expenses, which amounted to $2,040. Hammond handed her a cashier's check. She stared at it. "There are also some additional items at the property," Hammond said. He was looking at his folder. "Mr. Whitaker was explicit that they should remain at the cabin and be discovered there rather than inventoried here. He was, as I mentioned, a private man. He also had a particular sense of how things should happen." He looked up. "I'll confess, in 30 years of practice, I haven't had many clients like him." "What do you mean?" He was very precise, very intentional. Every aspect of this will and its terms had been thought through carefully. The language he used was specific in ways that suggested he knew exactly what he wanted. Hammond paused. "He wanted you to go there yourself, Miss Reyes. He wanted you to walk through that property. Those were his instructions." She got the directions from Hammond, printed on paper, because cell service in that part of the county was unreliable. She loaded Clara back into the car and drove 11 miles out of Harlan on a 2-lane road that climbed steadily into the hills, on the trees pressing close on both sides, the leaves coming down in drifts across the asphalt. "What did the man in there tell you?" Clara asked. "I have a great-grandfather I didn't know about. He had a friend who left us some property." "Is it the cabin?" "Yes." Clara turned this over. "Why didn't you know about your great-grandfather?" "I'm not sure. My mom didn't talk about him much. He died before I was born." "Maybe he was nice," Clara said. "Maybe that's why his friend gave us the cabin." The road narrowed after the 2nd-mile marker, gravel replacing asphalt, the surface rough and pocked from years of weather and infrequent maintenance. Elena drove slowly, the Civic's undercarriage complaining at the worst ruts. Trees on both sides now, the light going green and muted, the kind of October afternoon that was dark by 3:30 in the mountains. The mailbox was a dented metal cylinder on a wooden post, the numbers faded, but still legible. She turned in. The driveway was long and overgrown, a pair of tire tracks through high grass with a strip of weeds between them, the marks left by whatever infrequent traffic had come and gone over the years. Branches scraped the top of the car. Clara pressed her face to the window, watching the trees, her breath fogging the glass. The clearing opened up after the second bend. Elena stopped the car. The cabin sat in the middle of a 1/4 acre of cleared land, surrounded on 3 sides by the dense press of the mountain forest. It was built of rough timber and stone, the logs darkened with age and exposure, the mortar between the stones cracked and in some places missing entirely. The roof had partially collapsed on the left side, the section above what appeared to be a back room caving in and held in a kind of arrested falling by the remaining structure, like something that had decided to go and then changed its mind halfway through. Vines had come up the south wall, thick-stemmed and tenacious, working their way into the gaps between the logs. The porch across the front had warped and separated from the main structure, one end lifted slightly from the ground, as though the earth beneath it had shifted. 2 of the front windows were broken, the glass gone, the frames dark holes looking into the interior dimness. It was not a house. It was what happened to a house when the person who cared for it was gone. Clara was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's broken." "Some of it, yes. Can we fix it?" Elena looked at the collapsed roof section, at the rotted porch planks, at the vines that had taken decades to grow that deep into the structure. "I don't know," she said, because she didn't, and she had long since stopped making promises she couldn't keep. She got out of the car. The air was cold and clean and carried the smell of pine and leaf decay and something else underneath, something older, the mineral smell of the mountain itself. Birds moved in the trees above them. A creek ran somewhere she couldn't see, its sound low and continuous. They walked toward the cabin slowly. The porch held her weight, barely, the boards flexing and cracking underfoot, but not giving way. The front door was secured with a padlock that was newer than everything around it, not bright steel against weathered wood. Under the door frame, on a nail that Hammond had mentioned, was a small envelope with her name written in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside was a key. She fit the key into the padlock. It turned. The hasp swung open. She removed it and pushed on the door. It resisted, wood swollen and warped, then gave with a sound like something exhaling after a long-held breath, the bottom scraping against the floor as it swung inward. The smell came out first. Old wood and earth and dust and the particular staleness of a closed space that had not moved air in a long time. Underneath it, faint but present, something she couldn't quite name, something like old paper and iron. She stepped inside. The main room was perhaps 20 feet by 15. A stone fireplace dominated the east wall, deep and wide, the kind built to heat a whole space in serious cold. The floor was wide plank timber, darkened with age, dusty, but largely intact. So a wooden table sat near the center of the room with 2 chairs, one knocked over on its side. A shelf along the north wall held tin cans and a rusted oil lantern, and a stack of books, too warped by moisture to open without damage. Light came through the 2 broken front windows, cutting through the dust and shafts that made the particles in the air visible, slow and drifting. The back portion of the cabin, where the roof had given way, was sealed off by a door that had swollen shut, and its frame bulging with the weight of what had happened above it. Clara moved carefully through the main room, looking at everything with an attention Elena recognized as the particular absorption of a child who was making up her mind about something. She examined the fireplace, ran her finger along the shelf, picked up a tin can, and looked at the label. "Someone lived here," she said. "An old man. He's the one who left it to us." Clara set the can back carefully. "Did he know he was going to leave it to us?" "Yes, baby. He planned it." "Then maybe it's okay that it's broken," Clara said. She turned around slowly in the center of the room, looking at the ceiling, the walls, the floor. "Maybe he knew it was broken, and he left it anyway because of something else." Elena stood in the doorway with the afternoon light at her back and looked at her daughter standing in the middle of a broken cabin in Harlan County, Kentucky, and thought about what she knew of James Earl Whitaker, a private man, intentional, very precise about how things should happen. A man who had left this place to a woman he had never met because she was connected to something he had valued deeply enough to protect for decades. She thought about what Hammond had said. He had known exactly what he wanted. She took the sealed letter from her bag. Cream-colored envelope, wax seal. Her name and handwriting she didn't know. She looked at it for a long moment, then opened it carefully, breaking the wax seal along the edge. The handwriting inside was careful and deliberate, slightly shaky in the way of an elderly hand that had once been steady. The letters formed with the thoroughness of someone who had been taught that writing was worth doing properly. She read it quietly, her lips not moving, her breathing slowed. Clara had come to stand beside her. "What does it say?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She read it again. Then she looked up at the room around her, at the fireplace and the warped floor and the light coming through the broken windows, and felt something shift slightly in the way she was seeing it. "He says he's sorry about the condition of the place," she said. "He says there's more here than what I'm seeing. He says I need to look at the basement." "There's a basement?" Elena looked at the floor beneath her feet. Wide plank timber, fitted together, the boards running east to west. She crouched down and looked at the floor more carefully. The boards at the far end of the room, near the north wall, were slightly different, a shade darker, fitted differently, the seam between them more pronounced. She crossed the room and crouched down near the north wall. The seam was definitely different here. She ran her fingers along it. The boards were flush, but the gap between them was wider than the rest of the floor, and when she pressed down at one corner, she felt a faint give that the rest of the floor didn't have. Clara crouched down beside her. "Is it a door?" "I think so." "A floor door." Clara's voice had gone quiet, with the specific quality of a child whose faith in narrative was being, cautiously, rewarded. In the stories, that's where everything is. Elena pressed around the edges of the seam until her fingers found a small iron ring recessed into the wood, nearly flush, darkened to the same color as the board around it, so that you wouldn't see it unless you were already looking. She hooked her finger through it and pulled. The section of floor lifted. It was hinged at the far end, the hinge so well fitted and worn smooth that it barely sounded. A whisper of metal as the hatch swung up on its counterweighted arm and came to rest open against the wall. Below was a wooden stair, descending into darkness. The cold came up from the opening immediately, from a draft from below that carried that same smell she had noticed when she first entered the cabin. Stronger now. The smell of old paper and iron and something else. Something mineral and sealed. She aimed her phone flashlight down the stairs. Stone walls. A packed earth floor at the bottom, maybe 12 feet down. The beam caught the edge of something at the base of the stairs that she couldn't fully make out. Clara was leaning over the edge beside her, peering down. "Nah, can we go down?" Elena tested the first stair with her foot. It held. She went down carefully, one hand on the wall, the flashlight beam moving ahead of her. The stairs were solid, the wood different from the cabin above, denser, better preserved in the cool, dry air of the space below. She reached the bottom. The basement was larger than she had expected. The flashlight swept around, and she turned in a slow circle, trying to take in what she was seeing. The space ran the full length of the cabin above and was perhaps half its width, maybe 30 feet by 10, with stone walls and a ceiling supported by thick timber beams. The floor was packed earth, smooth and dry, the kind of dry that only came from excellent drainage and long absence of moisture. Along the west wall, shelves had been built directly into the stone, floor to ceiling, wooden shelves reinforced with iron brackets. And on those shelves, out arranged with a precision that stopped her breath, were rows of sealed containers. Metal boxes of various sizes, some small as shoeboxes, some larger, each one padlocked. Beside them, on the lower shelves, were what appeared to be filing boxes, sealed and labeled in a handwriting she was already learning to recognize. Clara came down the stairs behind her and stood at the bottom, looking. The flashlight beam caught the metal of the boxes, and they glinted softly in the darkness. There were more than she could count quickly, dozens at least. "Mom," Clara said, "I see it." "What is all that?" Elena moved closer to the nearest shelf. The labels on the filing boxes were written in Whitaker's careful, deliberate hand. Dates, categories, a system she didn't yet understand. She reached out and touched the nearest metal box. Small, maybe 8 inches square, its padlock new-looking despite the age of everything around it. She thought about what Hammond had said. Very intentional, very precise. He knew exactly what he wanted. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the part she hadn't read to Clara, the part near the end where Whitaker had written something she was still working to understand. He had written, "I have kept careful account of everything, Elena. Every piece of what is here was earned honestly and protected carefully. Your grandfather would have wanted this to go to his blood. I was the keeper. You are the inheritor. Start with the smallest box on the lowest shelf. That is where the story begins." She found the lowest shelf. She found the smallest box. The letter said there was a key. She looked back at the envelope it had come in, and there, at the bottom, taped inside the envelope's seam where she had not thought to look, was a small brass key on a paper tag. Elena stood in the basement of a collapsed cabin in Harlan County, Kentucky, with her 8-year-old daughter beside her and a brass key in her hand, and the cold breath of the mountain coming up through the stone walls, and rows of metal boxes arranged with a precision that could only mean one thing. Someone had been here for a long time, keeping something safe, waiting for the right person to come. She put the key in the lock of the smallest box. Clara reached up and put her hand over her mother's. They turned the key together. The smallest box held a journal. That was all. No gold, no cash, no document that would change the arithmetic of Elena's life before midnight. Just a journal, bound in dark green leather worn soft at the corners, the cover pressed with a simple pattern of mountains that had been touched enough times to go nearly smooth at the center. Elena lifted it out of the box carefully, the way you lift something that is old enough to have earned delicacy, and held it in both hands under the flashlight beam. Clara was leaning against her arm, trying to see. A book," Clara said. There was a careful neutrality in her voice, the specific neutrality of a child who had hoped for something larger and was deciding how to feel about what she had received instead. A journal. Elena turned it over. On the back cover, in the same deliberate handwriting she was already learning to recognize, was a single line. "For whoever comes after. Read this first. Then you will understand the rest." She opened to the first page. No, the handwriting inside was younger than the handwriting on the label, more fluid, less careful. The writing of a man who had not yet developed the deliberate slowness that age and intention produced. The date at the top of the first entry was March 3rd, 1971. Elena stood in the cold basement and read. The first entries were about a business. Two men, Whitaker and Robert Avila, Elena's grandfather, who had gone in together in 1969 on a trading and investment operation out of Harlan County. The work was not complicated to understand. They bought things others had undervalued and sold them to people who understood their worth. They were, from the earliest entries, very good at it. Whitaker's writing described the work with a precision and a pride that was not boastful, but mattered of fact. The pride of a man who had found the thing he was naturally suited to and was doing it well. The entries tracked everything: what they bought and what they paid, what they sold and what they received, the people they dealt with, some of them named, some described only by circumstance, the arguments between the two of them about which risks were worth taking and which were not, Whitaker the more cautious, Avila the more willing to reach. By 1975, they had begun to acquire more substantial things: property in multiple states, mineral rights, a small portfolio of bonds purchased at a time when bonds were less fashionable and therefore cheaper. Whitaker had a system for tracking all of it, a system described in the journal in meticulous detail, cross-referenced to filing boxes Elena had not yet opened. The entry for August 14th, 1979, was shorter than the others and written with a pressure that made the pen marks deeper in the paper. Robert is gone. Accident on Route 11. I don't know what to do with this. He was the reason any of this made sense. He had a daughter, Patricia, 10 years old. His wife is in no condition to handle any of the business affairs. I will manage what I can. I will keep what we built safe for when it matters. Elena's throat tightened. She read the next entry. And the next. Whitaker had become, in the years following her grandfather's death, the keeper of everything they had built together. He had continued to invest, carefully, conservatively, the way a man invests who is not investing for himself, but for an account he holds in trust. He had tracked Patricia's life from a distance, had known when she moved to Knoxville, had known when Elena was born, had known when Patricia died 4 years ago. And in all of that time, across 4 decades of careful management and patient accumulation, he had not touched the portion he considered to belong to Robert Avila's line. The last entry in the journal was dated 8 months ago, 2 months before he died. The handwriting was very slow now, very deliberate, each letter formed with effort. I don't know if Elena will come. I don't know if she is the kind of person who can see what I've built here for what it is. I hope she is. I hope she has some of Robert in her. He could see the worth in things that looked worthless to everyone else. That was his great gift. I tried to learn it from him. I'm not sure I ever did. Not the way he had it naturally. I have left her the cabin because the cabin was where we did our best thinking, Robert and I. We sat at that table and argued about numbers and drank bad coffee and figured things out. The roof is bad. The porch is bad. The whole structure needs work. But the basement is sound. I made sure of that. The basement is where everything important is. If she finds the journal, she'll find the rest. If she finds the rest, she'll understand. Elena closed the journal. She stood in the cold basement with her daughter, leaning against her arm, and looked at the rows of metal boxes on the shelves and the filing boxes labeled in Whitaker's handwriting, and felt something settle in her chest that was not yet hope, but was the precondition of it, the clearing of ground where something might grow. "What does it say?" Clara asked. "It says your great-great-grandfather and the man who owned this cabin were partners. Business partners. For a long time. And he saved things for us? I think so." Elena put the journal carefully back in its box. "I need to open the rest of these." The filing boxes came first. They were cardboard, sealed with tape that had dried and crackled when she peeled it back, dated in the sequence in which they needed to be opened. She worked through them in order, reading quickly, not her architectural brain, the part of her that had been trained to understand structures and systems and how the parts of complex things related to each other, engaging with the material in a way that bypassed the emotion she was not yet ready to feel and went directly to comprehension. The filing boxes contained the documentation of everything Whitaker had accumulated over 50 years. Property deeds, dozens of them. Several parcels in Kentucky and Virginia, and some of them in areas that had become substantially more valuable as the coal economy shifted, and the land itself had become the asset rather than what was under it. Mineral rights documents, carefully maintained, for properties in 3 states. A brokerage account statement from a firm in Lexington, the most recent statement dated 6 months before Whitaker's death, showing a portfolio that Elena had to read 3 times before she let herself believe the number she was seeing. She set the statement down on the earth floor and pressed her hands flat against her thighs. She picked it up again. The number was still the same. The brokerage portfolio alone, stocks and funds accumulated over half a century of patient, conservative investment, was valued at just over $68 million. Clara was watching her face. "Mom, what is it? Give me a minute." She moved to the next filing box. Real estate. The property deeds were organized by state and then by date of acquisition. Some of the properties were modest, rural parcels that Whitaker and her grandfather had purchased in the 70s for amounts that seemed almost comical now. Others were larger holdings. A commercial property in Lexington that had been purchased in 1983 for $80,000 and was now, based on the most recent tax assessment Whitaker had included, worth considerably more. An apartment building in Harlan itself, in 6 units, fully occupied according to rental records that went through the previous year. A warehouse outside of Pikeville that had been leased continuously to a regional logistics company since 1991. The total assessed value of the real property, calculated in Whitaker's hand on a summary sheet at the front of the box, was listed as $142 million. Elena sat down on the earth floor. She sat there for a moment with the filing box in her lap and the cold coming through the stone walls, and her daughter standing 3 feet away, watching her with the careful stillness of a child who knows something important is happening and is trying not to interfere with it. Then she got up and opened the metal boxes. There were 31 of them on the shelves. She worked from left to right, bottom shelf to top, on using the brass key for the smaller ones and finding additional keys inside for the larger ones, each key labeled in Whitaker's handwriting. The system cross-referenced to the filing boxes in a way that made sense once you understood his logic. The metal boxes contained the physical assets. Gold coins, sleeved individually in protective cases, each sleeve labeled with the coin's type and year. American eagles, maple leafs, South African Krugerrands, and several older pieces she didn't immediately recognize, their edges sharp and their surfaces unmarked by anything but time. She counted quickly, lost track, started again. There were hundreds of them. She could not calculate their current value without access to the market, but she understood, in the way she understood all numbers, that this was not a small amount. Bearer bonds, older ones, issued by municipalities and corporations across 3 decades. A stack of United States Treasury instruments, physical certificates in protective sleeves, each one with a face value she could read clearly, each one still valid, each one accrued to a current worth that the interest calculations in Whitaker's filing system helped her approximate. Jewelry she had not expected. Not a large quantity, but each piece significant, wrapped in acid-free cloth inside labeled envelopes. So a diamond brooch that caught her flashlight and scattered small points of light across the stone wall. Strand of pearls, a pair of emerald earrings, deep green, set in gold, that might have been purchased or might have been acquired in one of the trades Whitaker's journal described. The jewelry documentation in the accompanying file listed provenance for each piece, authentication certificates where they existed, purchase records for the ones Whitaker had acquired directly. In the last metal box, the largest one on the highest shelf, which required a step stool that Whitaker had left leaning against the wall for exactly this purpose, Elena found a sealed envelope with a summary document inside. She had expected this, had recognized the system well enough by now to know that Whitaker would not leave a collection this large without a summary. He hadn't. The document was typed, printed on a machine rather than handwritten, and was dated 14 months before his death. It was a complete accounting of the estate as of that date, organized by category, with estimated current values based on market conditions at the time and notes on likely appreciation. It was thorough and precise, and had clearly been prepared with the assistance of a professional, someone who understood financial instruments and valuation. At the bottom of the final page, below the total, in Whitaker's handwriting, was a note. Elena, and these numbers will change by the time you read this. Some up, some down. Markets do what they do. But the rough total, conservatively estimated, represents the accumulated work of 2 men across 50 years. Half of what you see here, by the terms of the understanding between Robert and me, was always his. Always intended for his line. That understanding was never written as a legal document, because Robert and I trusted each other with a completeness that made paperwork feel insulting. I've kept that half safe and growing for 44 years. I've added to it carefully, following the principles he and I developed together. I have not touched it except to protect it. The total, conservatively estimated, as of the date of this document, is $312 million. Elena read the sentence again. The total, conservatively estimated, is $312 million. She was sitting on the step stool on the highest shelf level, her flashlight propped against the stone wall, the document in her hands. Downstairs, or technically down the stairs, since she was in the basement, which meant she was below the floor of the already low-ground cabin, Clara was sitting on the bottom step with the journal open in her lap, trying to decipher Whitaker's handwriting by the light of her own small flashlight. $312 million. Elena had spent the better part of her adult life doing math. She was good at it. She understood numbers in the practical, granular way of someone for whom every number had a direct consequence, not as abstractions, but as things that determined whether the heat stayed on, or whether Clara ate breakfast from a box because the fresh eggs were $3 more than budget allowed. She understood money with an intimacy that people who had always had enough never developed. And now she was sitting in the basement of a collapsed cabin with a document in her hands that described a fortune she could not make feel real, no matter how many times she read the sentence. She climbed down the step stool carefully. "Mom," Clara looked up from the journal. "He wrote about great-great-grandpa a lot. He really liked him." "I know. He says he was the kind of person who could see the worth in something when nobody else could." Clara looked at her steadily. "No, that sounds like you." Elena sat down on the bottom step beside her daughter. She showed Clara the summary document, folding it so only the last paragraph was visible. Clara read it. She was 8 and she was a strong reader, and she understood numbers. She read it again. Mom. I know. Is that real? I think it is. I need to verify it. I need people who know about these things to look at everything. But the documents look real. And Whitaker was. She stopped. Thought. He was the kind of man who didn't do things carelessly. Everything down here is organized. Everything has documentation. Everything cross-references. He spent 50 years on this. She looked at the shelves of boxes, the rows of metal and paper and gold. I don't think a man who spent 50 years being careful would leave behind a folder full of fakes. Clara looked at the shelves for a long time. What do? We document everything. We photograph everything. And then we find someone who can help us figure out what to do next. They spent the next 2 hours photographing every box, every filing document, every coin, every bond, every certificate, every piece of jewelry. Elena's phone filled up, and she transferred the files, filled up again. She was methodical, the way she was methodical about everything, working shelf by shelf, making sure nothing was missed. Clara held the flashlight while Elena worked, steady and patient, not speaking much, a present in the concentrated way she sometimes was when she understood that what was happening mattered. The light through the broken windows above had shifted to the flat gray of late afternoon by the time they climbed back up the stairs and lowered the hatch. Elena stood in the main room of the cabin and looked at the space with different eyes than she had an hour before. The fireplace was still beautiful, actually, under the grime. The proportions of the room were generous. The timber, then where it was not damaged, was old growth, dense and dark, the kind that wasn't available anymore, the kind that lasted. "Can we stay here tonight?" Clara asked. "It's not safe to sleep in here. The roof," Elena gestured toward the sealed back door, the collapsed section beyond it. "But the front is okay." "The front is structurally okay. It's cold, and there's no power, and those windows need boarding." Clara considered this with the practical seriousness she brought to logistics. "We have the blankets from the car, and the slow cooker. If we get it up to temperature before the power has to be on." She stopped. "Oh, no power." "No power. But the fireplace, does it work?" Elena looked at the fireplace. She crossed to it and crouched, looking up into the chimney with her flashlight. The flue looked clear enough. The damper, ancient iron, was stuck in its closed position, but moved when she put force into it, scraping and then opening. No obvious blockage that she could see. The firebox was intact, the stones solid. "Maybe," she said. They gathered wood from the edge of the clearing, dry enough from the overhang of the trees, the kind that had been falling and drying for years. Clara was better at identifying the right pieces than Elena expected. She had been reading the adventure books. She knew about dry wood. The fire took 3 attempts, and then caught, small at first, and then larger, the chimney drawing steadily, the sound of it filling the cabin with the first warmth the space had held in what might have been years. They positioned themselves close to it on the floor, with the blankets from the car, and ate granola bars and the apple slices Elena had packed, and drank water from the bottles she always kept in the back seat. Clara leaned against Elena's shoulder and looked at the fire. "What happens to us now?" she said. Elena had been thinking about nothing else. The specific terror of it was not the fortune itself, but the change it represented. The way a thing that large and that sudden required you to restructure every assumption you had been operating on. And she had been operating on the same assumptions for so long that they had become the architecture of her thinking, invisible and load-bearing. You planned around scarcity. You made decisions, based on the certainty of not enough. You calibrated your hope to what was achievable from where you were, and not to what might be possible from somewhere else. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know some things that happen next. We go back to Knoxville. We find an attorney, a good one, someone who understands estates and asset verification. We get professionals to look at everything in that basement and tell us what it's actually worth and what the taxes are and what the legal situation looks like. We do that carefully and quietly." She paused. "Nobody needs to know about this yet." "What about the jobs?" Elena looked at the fire. She thought about the 348 alarm, about Darnell and his clipboard, and his precise measurements of her inadequacy, about the 14th floor bathroom and the sound the mop bucket made at that hour of the morning. "I'm going to keep going to the jobs," she said, "until we know for certain what we have, until it's verified and real and we understand all of it. Nothing changes until we know everything." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be hard." "Yes." "You're going to go back and clean those buildings knowing what's in this basement." "Yes." Clara thought about this. "That's actually very brave," she said, with the solemn authority of an 8-year-old delivering a considered verdict. Elena almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and a shudder. Not quite either. "Go to sleep. A baby." "I'm not tired." "Try anyway." Clara tried. Within 7 minutes, she was asleep with her head on Elena's leg, her breathing deep and even, one hand loosely holding the edge of the blanket. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the October wind moved through the trees, and the sound of the creek continued its low, unbroken thread. Elena sat awake for a long time. She thought about her grandfather, Robert Avila, who had died on Route 11 in 1979, who had been 10 years into building something real and had not lived to finish it, who had been Patricia's father, Patricia's loss, and Patricia had not talked about him except in fragments, the way you didn't talk about things that hurt too much to keep looking at directly. Elena had grown up with a grandfather-shaped absence and had never thought to investigate its edges. And somewhere in that absence, for 44 years, James Earl Whitaker had been keeping careful accounts. She thought about the letter, about the line that had moved her before she was ready to be moved. "I was the keeper. You are the inheritor." There were 2 ways to inherit something, she thought. You could receive it as luck, as something that arrived from outside your efforts and your choices, a fortunate accident of bloodline. Or you could receive it as the conclusion of something, the last movement of a longer story in which you were always going to be a participant, even if you hadn't known you were reading the early chapters. Whitaker had understood it as the second kind. He had written about Elena's grandfather, as though the work they had done together was not finished when Robert died, but only transferred, continuing in the careful custody of the man who survived. He had kept it alive for 44 years with the patience and the precision of someone who believed it would eventually matter, eventually reach the person it was meant to reach. She thought about what it meant that he had been watching from a distance, not interfering, not reaching out, but watching. Had known when Clara was born, had sent the revised will to Hammond after Patricia died. He had been waiting for exactly this. The fire burned lower. She added another piece of wood without waking Clara, and the fire caught it and brightened, and the warmth returned. The drive back to Knoxville the next morning was quieter than the drive out had been, while Clara slept for the first hour. Elena drove and thought and didn't turn the radio on. She had taken several more hours that morning to go through the basement again with fresh eyes, more slowly, making sure she had photographed everything, making sure she understood the filing system well enough to explain it to the kind of attorney who would need to understand it quickly. She had locked everything back in its place and relocked the hatch in the floor and locked the cabin door and taken both keys. She had stood in the clearing for a moment before getting in the car, looking at the collapsed roof, at the vines on the south wall, at the porch that listed slightly from the earth. The cabin looked exactly as broken as it had when she arrived. It looked exactly like what Darnell Price had predicted, a money pit in the middle of nowhere, or a problem disguised as an inheritance. She had thought about what Clara had said. Maybe he left it anyway because of something else, and about what Whitaker had written about her grandfather. He could see the worth in things that looked worthless to everyone else. She did not know yet whether she had that gift, but she was beginning to think that the test of it was not whether you could see it in objects, in parcels of land and portfolios of stocks and gold coins in protective sleeves. The test was whether you could see it in yourself, in your own battered and tired and overworked and underpaid life, and believe that it was worth something, that it could become something, that the story was not over simply because the current chapter was hard. She got in the car and drove home. The attorney she found was named Constance Webb. She came recommended by Hammond and Harlan, who had spent the 2 days since their meeting looking for exactly this person on Elena's behalf, not because he was required to, but because he was, as Elena was beginning to understand, the kind of man who cared about the outcomes of the situations he found himself adjacent to. Webb was in her mid-40s and operated out of a clean, unfussy office in downtown Knoxville, the kind of space that had good light and no unnecessary objects. She had spent 15 years in estate law after a decade in forensic accounting, and the combination meant she could look at financial instruments with the eye of someone who understood both their legal standing and their actual worth. She had a reputation for being direct and for not wasting her client's time or her own. Elena sat across from her with the photographs and the summary document and Whitaker's filing box, which she had brought back from Harlan in the trunk of the Civic, wrapped carefully in moving blankets. Webb spent 45 minutes going through everything without speaking. She was the kind of person who read carefully. Elena had learned to recognize that kind in the early going, the people who actually looked at what you gave them rather than forming a conclusion and then looking for confirmation of it. Webb looked at the photographs of the gold coins and the bearer bonds and the brokerage statement and the property deeds with equal and unhurried attention. Then she looked up. "The brokerage account is the easiest to verify," she said. "The account number is here. The firm is reputable. We can confirm the holdings within 48 hours. She set that page aside. "The physical assets, the gold, and the bonds require an appraiser. I have someone I use for estate work who is both excellent and discreet. He can be at the property within the week." She looked at the property deeds. The real estate needs title searches in each state, which takes longer, but the deeds themselves appear well executed. "Is it real?" Elena said. "Is this something real?" Webb was quiet for a moment. "Based on what I've seen today, I believe so. I want to be careful with language until I've had everything independently verified, but nothing here shows the signs of fabrication. The internal consistency is remarkable. The documentation cross-references itself in ways that are genuinely hard to fake, and unnecessary to fake if you were going to fake something." She put her hands flat on the desk. "The man who built this filing system was not building a fiction. He was building a record." She looked at Elena directly. "I've been doing this work for a long time. This is the most meticulously documented estate I have ever seen. He wanted there to be no doubt." Elena let out a breath she had been holding since Tuesday. "I need you to tell me about the risks," Elena said. "What could go wrong?" Webb nodded. "A few things. First, bearer bonds are no longer issued, and their legal status has become complex in recent years. Some of them will be straightforward to redeem. Others may require additional steps. That's manageable, but not instantaneous." She moved to the next concern. The mineral rights documents are the most complicated part of the real estate portfolio. Depending on what has happened with some of these properties since the rights were recorded, there may be disputes or claims to navigate. She paused. And then there is the issue of public disclosure. Meaning what? Meaning that when a probate matter of this size becomes part of the public record, which it eventually will, it attracts attention. Not immediately, because Harlan County is not a place where this kind of thing happens often, and the initial filing will not be high profile. But eventually, she looked at Elena carefully. You will want to have a structure in place before that happens. Legal entities, security arrangements, a plan for how to handle the people who will appear. She paused. And they will appear. What kind of people? Relatives you've never met. Former associates of Whitaker's who believe they have a claim. People who will read about this in the local paper and construct an entitlement from nothing. It happens in every substantial estate. The larger the estate, the larger the creative thinking about who deserves a share of it. She held Elena's gaze. The key is not to be surprised by it, and not to react from a place of fear. That's how people get taken advantage of. Elena thought about Darnell, about the way he had occupied the space where her hopes might have lived, about the architecture of low expectations that people like him built around people like her, beam by beam, lecture by lecture, until the structure felt like reality. I've been managing difficult people at close quarters for a long time, she said. Webb looked at her for a moment. I believe that, she said. The verification process began the following week. Webb's appraiser, a compact and quiet man named Stephen Cho, who had spent 30 years valuing estate assets and seemed genuinely indifferent to the dollar amounts involved as long as his methodology was being respected, drove to Harlan County on a Wednesday with 3 assistants and a van full of equipment and spent 2 full days in the basement. Elena could not be there. She was at the fulfillment center, scanning boxes, keeping her head down, doing the work the way she always did it, efficiently and without drama. Darnell made no appearances. The shift was unremarkable. She ate her lunch in the break room and did not tell anyone anything. Cho called her that evening. His voice was carefully neutral in the way of professionals who had learned not to lead with conclusions. He said he wanted to give her a complete picture before she started making decisions, and he walked her through what his team had cataloged with the same methodical patience she had recognized in Whitaker's filing system. The gold coins, he said, were genuine. The collection was substantial and included several pieces that had numismatic value beyond their metal content, coins of sufficient rarity that they would be of interest to serious collectors as well as bullion dealers. His estimated current value for the coin collection alone was $23 million. Elena sat in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear, and Clara in the next room doing homework, and said nothing. The bearer bonds were genuine, Cho continued. He had confirmed authenticity with a financial instruments specialist he trusted, who had examined each piece physically and reviewed the serial numbers against available records. The face value plus accumulated interest brought the total for the bond portfolio to approximately $41 million, with a caveat that redemption of some of the older instruments would take time. The brokerage account Webb had confirmed through her own contacts. $68,400,000, give or take market movement on any given day. The jewelry he had photographed and sent to a gemologist in New York. The preliminary assessment based on photographs was $40 to $50 million, contingent on detailed examination of each piece. He would have a final figure within 3 weeks. The mineral rights were being reviewed by a specialist. The early indication was that several of the parcels were in areas of renewed energy development interest, which significantly affected their current value. He expected the mineral rights assessment to be the most time-consuming component. The real estate, based on his review of the tax assessments and current market comparisons, was likely to come in above the $142 million that Whitaker's summary had listed, because property values in several of the regions where Whitaker had held land had increased substantially in the past 14 months. He paused. "I want to give you a current rough total," he said. "Understanding that this is preliminary, before the mineral rights assessment and before the jewelry gemologist's final number." "Yes," Elena said. He gave her the number. It was $319 million. The summary Whitaker had left had said $312 million. He conservatively estimated. He had been, if anything, slightly conservative. Elena put her hand over her mouth. "Ms. Reyes," Cho said, "are you there?" "I'm here. I want to say one more thing." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing this work for 30 years. I've assessed a lot of estates. Some of them were large. This one is in a different category, not because of the dollar amount, but because of the construction of it." He paused again. "So, the man who built this did it with extraordinary care. Every asset is documented. Every purchase has a record. The tax filings are complete and proper. There are no irregularities, no gaps in the chain of custody, nothing that suggests anything other than exactly what the documents say it is. He built this so that whoever received it would receive it cleanly." A pause. "In 30 years, I've never seen anything quite this deliberate." After she hung up, Elena sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The watermark was still on the ceiling. The refrigerator made the same faint humming sound it always made. The stack of bills on the counter was the same stack, or a new one that looked exactly like the old ones. The formatting of difficulty so consistent that the details changed and the feeling didn't. She was going back to the fulfillment center tomorrow morning, and to the office building at 4 a.m., and to the diner on Saturday. For now she was, because Constance Webb had been clear. The process of verification and legal establishment of the estate would take months, not weeks. During that time, the assets would be protected and documented, but they were not yet accessible. The legal structures needed to be built, the entities established, the transfer of each asset class managed in the right sequence. Moving too fast or telling the wrong people would create complications that could delay everything significantly, or, in a worst case, create legal vulnerabilities that someone with resources could exploit. Elena understood this with the precision she brought to all numbers. The money was real. The money was coming. But the money was not yet hers in any practical sense, and until it was, she was still the woman who woke up at 3:48 in the morning and went to clean buildings and did not have $25 for a school field trip. It was just that now she knew something different about the story she was in. She went to Clara's room and stood in the doorway. Clara was asleep, one arm out of the blanket, the library book fallen open beside her, where she had dropped it when sleep arrived. The plastic dresser from the garage sale. The photograph on the wall, on the two of them squinting in the park. Clara's drawings covering every surface that wasn't taken. Elena watched her daughter sleep for a while. Then she went and paid the field trip deposit online. $25. She had the $2,040 from Whitaker's bank account, the cashier's check she had deposited on Monday. She had been almost unable to touch it for 3 days, as though spending any part of it would confirm that it was real, which also meant confirming that it could be taken away. She paid the $25. She refilled the school lunch account for the full month instead of the week. She sat back down. The difficulty of the weeks that followed was specific and peculiar in a way that she had not anticipated. She had thought that knowing would make everything easier. She had been wrong. Knowing made the daily reality harder, not because the daily reality had worsened, but because she could now see it clearly from outside it, could see the 3:48 alarm and the mop bucket and Darnell's clipboard and the break room lunch as temporary in a way they had never felt before. And the contrast between what she knew and what she was still living was a particular kind of ache. She went back to the fulfillment center. She went back to the office building. She was at her packing station on a Thursday afternoon, on 3 weeks after Harlan, when Darnell came to her station with the energy of a man who had information he had been waiting to deploy. She saw him coming from 2 stations away. The expression was familiar. The clipboard was in his hand. The small power was in his bearing. "Mitchell and HR told me you took 2 unpaid days last month," he said. "I did. For that Kentucky thing." She looked at him steadily. "For a family matter, yes." "How'd that go?" His voice was performing casualness. "So you drive all the way out there, and it turned out to be what I thought? Falling down shack, not worth the gas money?" Elena looked at her scanner. She looked at the box in front of her. She looked at Darnell's face, which was arranged in the expression of someone who had already decided the answer and was asking only for the pleasure of hearing it confirmed. She thought about Whitaker in his careful basement for 40 years, about Robert Avila, who could see the worth in things when nobody else could, about the stack of metal boxes in the cold dark under the broken floor, organized and labeled and waiting. She thought about what she knew that Darnell Price did not know. "It was interesting," she said. "I'm still looking into it." He made a sound. "That means it was nothing." She turned back to her station and started scanning. "I really need to focus on my numbers," she said. "I'm trying to get to the 95th percentile." He stood there for another moment, waiting for something more, and then left when it was clear she was not going to give it to him. She scanned the next box, and the next. 3 days later, a different kind of problem arrived. It came in the form of a man Elena had never seen before, sitting in a car outside her apartment building when she came home from the diner shift on Saturday evening. She noticed the car because it was nicer than any car that typically parked on her street, and she noticed the man because he noticed her first, with the specific attention of someone who has been waiting and has now seen what they were waiting for. He got out of the car as she walked toward the building entrance. He was well-dressed, mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who had learned to occupy space as though it belonged to him. "Ms. Reyes." He said her name with the certainty of someone who already knew the answer. She stopped. "Who are you?" "My name is Robert Gantry. I represent a group of investors with historical business ties to James Whitaker's estate." He smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind with no feeling behind it. "I wanted to introduce myself before the process moved further. I think there may be aspects of Mr. Whitaker's portfolio that could benefit from some clarification in terms of their origins, and I'd love to sit down with you and your legal team and talk through some of the history." Elena held her bag strap. She thought about what Webb had said. People who will read about this and construct an entitlement from nothing. She thought about the way he had said clarification of their origins, the specific selection of words designed to introduce doubt. "I have representation," she said. "Any communication needs to go through my attorney." His smile adjusted. "Of course. Of course. I just wanted to make personal contact first, neighbor to neighbor. These things can get adversarial if they start on the wrong foot." He held out a business card. "I hope we can approach this as people who have a shared interest in making sure the right things happen." She did not take the card. "Please contact my attorney." She gave him Webb's name and said nothing else. She went inside, locked the door, and called Webb from the kitchen while Clara was in the shower. Webb was unsurprised. "It was faster than I expected," she said, "but not unexpected." "Do you know who Robert Gantry is?" "No." "He's a lawyer in Lexington who represents a family called the Breens. The Breens had several business dealings with Whitaker over the years, most of them resolved long ago. One of them that ended in a dispute that Whitaker won definitively in 2003. Her voice was composed and matter-of-fact. "Gantry has been doing this for a long time. So he finds estates and creates doubt about origins, and either gets a settlement or delays things long enough to get a nuisance payment. She paused. He doesn't have a case. He's fishing. Should I be worried? You should be aware. There's a difference. She paused. He'll come again, or someone like him will. What I want you to know is that Whitaker's documentation is so complete that there is no legitimate avenue for a claim against this estate. The Breen dispute was settled and finalized. The settlement documents are in the filing boxes. Whitaker kept everything. Elena thought about the deliberate hand going through those files, the label maker, the cross-references, the 44 years of careful keeping. He had known this was coming. He had prepared for it. He built this so nobody could take it, Elena said. Yes. Webb's voice held something that was not quite admiration, but was in that vicinity. Yes, so I think that's exactly right. Elena put her phone down on the kitchen table. Outside her window, the Knoxville night was ordinary and familiar. The same sounds she had been hearing for 4 years from this apartment, the same neighbor's television, the same rhythm of the street. But underneath it, or somewhere connected to it in a way she was only beginning to understand, something was moving. Something that had been moving for 50 years was arriving at its destination. She went to check on Clara. Her daughter was out of the shower, in pajamas, standing at the kitchen table with Whitaker's journal open in front of her. Elena had brought it back from Harlan. She had been reading it every few days in small pieces, carefully, the way you read something that carries weight. Mom, Clara said, he wrote about what he wanted you to do with it. Elena came to stand beside her. Where? Clara pointed to an entry near the back, one of the later ones. The handwriting slowed and careful. Elena read it. I don't expect her to keep all of it. I don't think keeping all of it would be good for a person or for a child growing up in it. I think what I hope is that she understands what Robert and I understood, which is that worth is not the same as price, and that the best use of a thing is not always the most obvious one. I built this fortune by seeing what other people missed. I hope she uses it to make sure other people stop missing things. I hope she uses it for good work. I don't know what that means for her exactly. I trust that she will. Elena read the entry twice. Then she closed the journal carefully and put it back where it lived, which was on the shelf next to the framed photograph of her and Clara at Riverside Park, both of them squinting into the sun. 3 months. Webb had said 3 months before the first structures would be in place. 3 months of 348 alarms and mop buckets and Darnell's clipboard. And she could do that. She had been doing hard things for her whole life. This was just a different kind of waiting. The 3 months passed the way hard things pass, not quickly, not gracefully, but with the specific stubbornness of something that can be endured because it has to be. Elena woke at 3:48 every morning. She went to the office buildings and the fulfillment center and the diner on Magnolia Avenue. She carried the mop bucket and the scanner and the coffee pot with the same hands that had touched a 100-year-old journal in a basement that held $319 million. And she did not think about the contrast when she could help it, because the contrast was a particular kind of torture that she had decided she did not have time for. She thought instead about Whitaker, about a man who had sat in that cabin with bad coffee and good arguments and built something careful and real across 50 years. She thought about what patience looked like at that scale, what faith looked like, the faith required to keep something safe for someone you had never met, for a reason that was entirely about honoring a commitment to someone who was already gone. She thought about her grandfather, Robert Avila, who could see the worth in things. She had not known him. She had barely known his shadow, the shape his absence had made in her mother's life, the way Patricia never talked about him without going somewhere quieter in herself, somewhere that had never quite healed. She would never know him now, but she was beginning to feel in the way you feel the presence of something through its effects, like feeling wind through the movement of leaves, what kind of man he might have been. She kept the journal on the shelf next to the photograph and read it in small pieces, a few entries at a time, the way you read something you do not want to finish, because finishing it means losing the sense of company it provides. Constance Webb called on a Tuesday morning in late January, while Elena was on the bus between the office building and the fulfillment center, standing in the aisle with her phone pressed to her ear and the city moving past the windows in the thin winter light. "We're ready," Webb said. "The structures are in place. The asset transfers are completed. I have the final verified totals for everything, including the mineral rights assessment that just came through." Elena's hand tightened on the overhead rail. "Tell me." Webb gave her the numbers, category by category, the way Cho had, methodically and completely. The mineral rights had come in significantly above any of the preliminary estimates, and several of the parcels were in areas where new energy development had made the subsurface rights genuinely valuable, and the legal framework Whitaker had used to hold them was clean and uncontested. The final assessment added another $22 million beyond what Cho had estimated. The jewelry gemologist's final number was $47 million. The real estate had appreciated further during the months of legal processing because the market did not pause for probate. The complete verified total of Elena Reyes' inheritance from the estate of James Earl Whitaker, after all estate taxes paid and all legal fees settled, was $312 million. Whitaker's conservative estimate to the dollar. Elena stood on the bus with the city going past and the phone at her ear and said very quietly, so that the people near her could not hear, "Is it done? Is it actually done?" "It's done," Webb said. "The accounts are yours. The deeds are in your name, and through the entity structure we established. You can begin making decisions whenever you're ready." A brief pause. "There's no rush. Take whatever time you need." Elena closed her eyes for 2 seconds. The bus stopped. People pushed past her to get off. She moved to let them by. "I know what I want to do first," she said. She had known for 3 months, actually. She had decided on the bus home from the fulfillment center on a Thursday night in November, or standing in the aisle the way she was standing now, holding the overhead rail while the city moved. She had decided quietly and completely, the way she made all her important decisions, not in a moment of drama, but in a moment of clarity, when the noise went away and the thing that was true became simply visible. She called into all 3 jobs that afternoon and gave notice. She called the janitorial company first. Harold answered, and she told him she would not be coming back, that she was sorry for the short notice, that she had valued working with him. Harold, who communicated primarily through nods, but occasionally through words when words were the only instrument available, said she had been one of the best people on his crew and that he hoped things went well for her. And the sincerity in his voice was the unexpected kind, the kind that arrived before you could prepare for it. She called the fulfillment center's HR line and was routed to a voicemail. She left a message that was brief and professional, giving 2 weeks' notice and explaining that she would not be coming in to work the remaining shifts, that she was available if they had questions, and that she thanked them for the opportunity. She thought about calling back to ask for Darnell specifically, just to tell him directly. She decided against it. He would find out in his own way, and at his own time, and whatever satisfaction she might have taken from telling him was smaller than the satisfaction of simply not needing to. The diner on Magnolia was different. The manager there was a woman named Rosa, 60 years old, who had been running the place for 22 years and had a particular quality of steadiness that Elena had always respected. She went in person on Saturday morning, before the shift, and asked to speak to Rosa privately. She told Rosa a version of the truth, that she had come into an inheritance, that it was significant, that she would not be coming back. She said this clearly and without drama, and Rosa looked at her for a long moment, and then reached across the counter and squeezed her hand and said, "Good. You were always too smart for this." Elena had not expected that, and did not fully process it until she was in the parking lot. She sat in the Civic for a while. The fact that she was crying was unexpected, and also, when she thought about it, not surprising at all. She was crying for the years, for the 348 alarms and the mop buckets, and the $412 in the checking account, and the dollar store birthday supplies, and the school field trip form that had sat on the counter for 3 weeks because $25 was not a small number. She was crying for her mother, who had died, not knowing that her father's partner had been keeping something safe in a basement in Kentucky for all of her adult life. She was crying for the version of herself that had sat at that kitchen table with the calculator and the bills and told herself that this was just how things were, that the math would never quite work, that surviving was the best available outcome. She wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because the weight she had been carrying had been set down, and the sensation of that was its own particular grief, the grief of all the years spent under the weight, which you could only fully feel once it was gone. She dried her face. She drove home. Clara was at a friend's apartment in the building, the daughter of a neighbor named Diane, a connection that had developed quietly over the past months and that Elena had been careful to protect, one of the few friendships Clara had that was entirely ordinary, built on shared interests and proximity rather than on anything related to what was happening in the background of their lives. Elena made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and called Webb. "I want to start the foundation work," she said. "I want to move quickly on that. Tell me more about what you're thinking." Elena had been thinking about it for 3 months, in the margins of early mornings and bus rides and break room lunches. She had thought about it while scrubbing the 14th floor bathroom, and while scanning boxes, and while carrying coffee to tables at the diner. When she had thought about Whitaker's journal entry, "I hope she uses it for good work," and about what her grandfather had been before Route 11 in 1979, before he became an absence in the shape of his daughter's silences. "Whitaker and my grandfather built something by seeing worth that other people missed," she said. "I want to do the same thing, but not with properties or investments, with people." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. Single parents, people working multiple jobs, on trying to give their kids something better, doing the invisible work that makes other people's lives possible, the ones the world thinks are just surviving. I want to build something for them. What specifically? Housing assistance, not charity, investment. Down payment matching for people who have stable income but can't save fast enough because the math never catches up. Scholarships, not just tuition but the full cost, the child care and the transportation and the lost wages, the real cost of going back to school when you're supporting a family, and a small business fund. Loans, not grants, real loans with real terms, for people who have a plan and the capability and just need the first capital that no bank will give them. She paused. "And I want it named for them. For Whitaker and my grandfather. The Whitaker-Avila Foundation. Because neither of them would have built what they built without the other, and they both believed in the same thing, which is that worth is not the same as price." Webb was quiet for a moment. "I can help you structure that. It will take some additional legal work to establish the foundation properly." "I know. I want it done right. I want it to be something that lasts." "It will." Elena sat with her coffee and the ordinary sounds of her apartment, the refrigerator hum, the neighbor's television, the distant sound of the city. She thought about all the mornings she had sat at this table with the calculator. She thought about the woman who was going to receive the first housing match from the Whitaker-Avila Foundation, whoever she was, sitting at her own table with her own calculator, running the same numbers that never quite worked. She thought, She does not know yet that the math is about to change. The first person who found out, apart from Webb and Cho and the small circle of professionals who had been part of the verification process, was Clara. Elena sat down with her daughter that evening at the kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten spaghetti with jar sauce and soup from the slow cooker and dollar store birthday cake. Clara was doing homework. She closed her notebook when she saw her mother's expression. "Is it done?" Clara said. "It's done." Clara looked at her for a moment. How much did everything actually come to? After all the checking? $312 million. Clara sat very still. She had known the rough number since Harlan County, but verified and final was different from preliminary and theoretical, and they both felt the difference. "Okay," Clara said quietly. "Then, are we moving?" "Yes, but not right away. I want to choose carefully. I want it to feel like home. Can we have a yard?" "Yes." "Can Scout come?" Scout was the name Clara had given the neighborhood cat who sometimes sat on their windowsill. The cat was not theirs in any technical sense, but had been Clara's in every other sense for 8 months. "We'll figure out Scout." Clara looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "Mom, are you okay?" Elena looked at her daughter, the dark eyes that were Marco's, the set jaw that was hers. The homework notebook closed carefully, the question asked directly without preamble, the instinct to check on the person she loved before thinking about herself. "I'm going to be," Elena said. I think I really am." The news became public 10 days later, not through any choice of Elena's, but through the ordinary machinery of probate records, which were public filings, and which a local reporter in Harlan County had pulled in the course of covering a different estate matter and had recognized as significant. The story that ran in the Harlan Daily Enterprise was factual and brief. A Knoxville woman had inherited the estate of local businessman James Earl Whitaker, whose assets had been more substantial than the community had known. The wire services picked it up within 24 hours. The framing varied. Some of them led with the human angle, the single mother, and the collapsed cabin, and the hidden fortune. The elements that made for a story readers would feel rather than just follow. Others led with the dollar amount. A few went looking for the Kenny Rogers connection, which did not exist, and was a different story entirely. But that did not stop 3 different outlets from suggesting a connection that required significant mental gymnastics to manufacture. Elena's phone received 47 calls in the first 12 hours from numbers she did not recognize. She answered none of them. Webb had prepared a brief statement that was released through her office, confirming the inheritance, declining further comment, and directing all inquiries to legal counsel. Gantry appeared again, and this time with a formally filed motion in Harlan County Court, asserting that his clients, the Breen family, had an historic interest in a portion of Whitaker's portfolio based on a business relationship in the 1990s. Webb demolished it in 11 days with documentation from Whitaker's filing boxes, the 2003 settlement agreement, and a supplementary brief that was, by Webb's own understated assessment, thorough. A man who claimed to be Whitaker's nephew appeared in the comment section of the Harlan Daily Enterprise article and subsequently in a message to Webb's office. He was not Whitaker's nephew. Whitaker had no living relatives. Webb dealt with him in a letter that was 4 sentences long. 2 women contacted Elena through the Foundation's preliminary website, which had gone live in advance of the media coverage, claiming to be distant relatives of Robert Avila with entitlements to the estate. Elena sent their information to Webb and did not engage with either of them directly. She was not cruel about it. She simply did not respond. The flood of attention lasted about 3 weeks and then subsided to a manageable flow of media requests, most of which Webb fielded or declined on Elena's behalf. The serious journalists, the ones who wanted to write carefully about Whitaker and about what he had built, and about the nature of the inheritance, she agreed to speak to selectively, on her own terms. One of those conversations was with a journalist from a regional magazine who was writing a longer piece about economic inequality and inherited wealth, and who approached the story with a seriousness Elena respected. The journalist asked her what it felt like to move from working 3 jobs to being among the wealthiest people in the state in the space of a few months. Elena thought about how to answer that honestly. "It doesn't feel like I became a different person," she said. "It feels like the circumstances changed. I'm the same person who cleaned offices and scanned boxes and worked the diner. Those experiences are part of me, and I don't want to pretend they're not. Because what I lived through is directly connected to what I'm trying to build now." She paused. "What changed is the math. The math worked against me for a long time. Now it works for me. And because I know what it feels like when it works against you, I know what it means for it to change." The journalist asked about Whitaker. "He was the most patient person I never met," Elena said. "He held something for 44 years because he believed it would eventually matter to someone. That kind of patience requires a faith I find genuinely humbling." She looked at her hands for a moment, the hands that were no longer cracked from cleaning chemicals, that had begun, gradually, to look their age instead of older. "I want to be worthy of that faith. I'm not sure I'll ever stop trying to figure out what that means." The house came first. Webb and a real estate attorney worked together to identify something appropriate, and appropriate meant something Elena had thought about carefully and specifically. Not a mansion, not a gated community, not a statement of wealth that put distance between her and the world she had come from, and that the foundation was built to serve. A house in a good school district, with a yard. I'm in a neighborhood where Clara would grow up alongside children from many kinds of families and not be raised in a bubble of affluence that would make her a stranger to the majority of human experience. They found it in a neighborhood in West Knoxville, a craftsman-style house from the 1940s, 4 bedrooms, a porch that needed work but was structurally sound, a backyard with a mature oak tree that Clara declared immediately and without qualification to be hers. The purchase price was far below what Elena could have spent, and exactly what she needed to spend to get something real and lasting that felt like home rather than like a trophy. Clara stood in the backyard under the oak tree on the first day and looked up through the bare winter branches at the sky and then at her mother and said, "This one." "This one," Elena agreed. They moved on a Saturday in February. There was not a great deal to move. Their furniture was mostly things found at garage sales and thrift shops, which Clara had always treated with a proprietary affection that had nothing to do with their monetary value and everything to do with the stories she had invented for them. The plastic dresser with the unicorn sticker on the 3rd drawer. The kitchen table with the wobbly leg that Elena had shimmed with a folded piece of cardboard for 3 years. The framed photograph from Riverside Park. Elena kept all of it. She added to it gradually, carefully. Things chosen because they were good, and because she loved them, and because the house was a place she intended to live in, fully rather than perform a life in. Clara had a room of her own, a real one, large enough for a proper desk and bookshelves and wall space for the drawings that had covered every surface of the apartment on Caldwell Street. Scout, the windowsill cat from the apartment building, was brought along in a carrier that Clara had purchased with money from her allowance, with the gravity of someone making a significant investment. Scout surveyed the new house with the cautious authority of a cat reassessing territory and declared it, over the course of 3 days, acceptable. The Whitaker Avila Foundation's first operational quarter began in March. Webb had connected Elena with a nonprofit governance specialist named Marcus Okafor, who had spent 20 years building and running foundations, and who had, in their first meeting, listened to Elena describe what she wanted the foundation to do, and then said, without any softening of the kind that professionals sometimes used when they thought you hadn't thought things through, This is exactly the right structure for what you're trying to accomplish, and you're thinking about it the right way. She had not expected that, and had trusted him immediately because of it. Okafor helped her build a board of 7 people. Elena chaired it. The other 6 were practitioners, a housing advocate who had spent 15 years in affordable housing development, a financial literacy educator who ran workshops at community colleges, a pediatrician who worked in a clinic in a low-income neighborhood and understood from the inside what material scarcity did to families and children, a small business consultant who had helped hundreds of entrepreneurs access their first capital, a single mother who had been through the exact circumstances the foundation was designed to serve and had rebuilt her life through education and was now finishing a master's degree in social work, and Marcus Okafor himself in an advisory capacity. The first call for housing match applications opened on March 15th and received 412 applications within 72 hours. Elena read every one. She had said she would read every one, and Okafor had looked at her with the patient skepticism of someone who had watched well-intentioned foundation directors discover the gap between intention and capacity. And she had said she understood that it would take time, that she was not promising to read them by Friday, only that every single application would receive her eyes before any decision was made by the selection committee. Because every one of those applications was a person who had sat at a table and done the math and found it didn't work and had decided to try anyway. She read them at the kitchen table in the evenings while Clara did homework. She read them on Saturday mornings with coffee. She read them on a Tuesday night at 2 a.m. when she could not sleep, and pulled them up on her laptop and sat in the kitchen in the dark house. They were, as she had known they would be, mirrors. A woman in Memphis, working 2 jobs as a home health aide, supporting 3 children, with a credit score that had been devastated by a medical emergency 2 years ago, and a savings rate that was meticulous and insufficient. A man in Chattanooga who had been working at the same warehouse for 9 years and had never missed a shift, and whose combined income with his wife still couldn't accumulate a down payment fast enough to outpace the market. A woman in Nashville who reminded Elena so precisely of herself in the details of her daily structure, the 4 a.m. starts and the carefully divided budget, and the child mentioned in one line as the reason for all of it, that she had to set the laptop down for a moment and breathe. The selection committee made the first 40 decisions in early April. Elena agreed with 38 of them and advocated successfully for changing 2. She was not interested in perfect agreement. She was interested in good outcomes. The first housing match recipient was a woman named Adriana Fuentes, single mother, 2 daughters, food service worker, had been saving for a down payment for 4 years, with a discipline that the foundation's financial reviewer called genuinely extraordinary. The match brought her to the threshold. The phone call went the way Webb had warned it might go, and the way Cho had demonstrated it went, and the way Elena was beginning to understand. All these calls went. Silence, then breathing, then something that was not quite a word. Elena waited. "Is this real?" Adriana said. Her voice was very quiet. "I need you to tell me this is real." "It's real," Elena said. "I know how it feels to hear that and not believe it. But it's real. You saved carefully for 4 years, Adriana. This is what that looks like when someone is paying attention." The silence on the other end went on for several seconds. "I don't know how to—" She stopped and started again. "My girls, they're going to have a yard." Elena pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment. "Yes," she said. "They are." She made 40 calls that first quarter, everyone the same and everyone completely different. The detail of each life specific and irreplaceable. The sound of each person receiving news they had stopped letting themselves hope for. She insisted on making the calls herself. Okafor had gently suggested that as the foundation grew, this would become impractical, Saw that staff could handle recipient notification with warmth and professionalism. She had agreed that it would eventually need to be that way. Not yet. Not while she could still remember exactly what it felt like to be on the other end of the news that the math had changed. The scholarship fund announced its first cohort in May. 20 recipients, full cost of attendance, including childcare and transportation. Not just tuition, but the real architecture of what it took to go to school when you were supporting a family. Elena had insisted on the real cost because she knew from her own calculations how often the nominal cost of something was a fraction of the actual cost. Once you added in everything the nominal cost assumed you already had. One of the 20 was a woman named Patricia. Elena had not done it on purpose. She had not been looking for the name. She had read the application on a Wednesday night and had been moved by it on its own terms, by the specificity of the woman's circumstances and the clarity of her plan and the particular quality of hope that ran through her writing. The hope of someone who had decided to try despite having every reason not to, and had marked it for the committee's consideration. It was Marcus who had pointed out the name, gently, after the selections were finalized. Elena had sat with that for a while. Then she had thought, yes, of course, that seems right. The cabin in Harlan County was the thing she returned to most often in her thinking, and eventually in person. She drove out with Clara in late April, when the mountains were showing their first green, and the air had that particular quality of early spring in Appalachia, cold and clean and full of something like promise. She had arranged for a local contractor to assess the structure, and she arrived at the property to find a man named Earl Combs waiting in the clearing with a clipboard and the careful eyes of someone who understood old construction. Clara walked straight to the porch and stood on it, testing the boards with the authority of someone who had been here before and had opinions about the place. Combs walked Elena through his assessment with the thoroughness of a man who respected the work he was being asked to evaluate. The collapsed roof section could be rebuilt. The foundation was sound, remarkably so. The original stonework competent and durable in a way that was less common in structures of this age. The front portion of the cabin, the main room with the fireplace, needed significant work, but was fundamentally salvageable. The basement was in better condition than anything above it, which made a certain kind of sense, given that Whitaker had maintained it with specific attention for decades. You could restore it, Combs said. It would take 8 to 12 months, and it wouldn't be cheap. But the bones are good. Elena stood in the clearing and looked at the cabin, the vines on the south wall, the sagging porch, the partial collapse on the left side, the building in its arrested state of falling. She thought about what she had felt when she first saw it, the instinct to calculate the cost of fixing it against the value of selling it. The voice that said this is what Darnell had predicted, a shack in the woods, a money pit, nothing of value. And underneath that, below the voice of every person who had ever told her what she couldn't have and where she didn't belong, the quieter thing. Her grandfather had sat at this table. He and Whitaker had argued about numbers and drank bad coffee and figured things out. The cabin had been the place where something real was built. Restore it, she said. Exactly as it was, with everything that can be preserved. Combs nodded. He made a note on his clipboard. One more thing, Elena said. The basement. I want it converted into a reading room, not changed structurally, just finished properly. Stone walls, good light, shelves. She paused. There should be shelves. Combs looked at her for a moment. What kind of shelves? The good kind, she said. The kind that last. Clara had found a stick and was drawing something in the dirt of the clearing, at a large shape that Elena could not make out from where she was standing. She walked over to look. It was a map. The cabin at the center, the driveway leading out through the trees, A small square that might have been a creek or a pond, and at the four compass points, animals. A bear, an owl, a fox, a deer. Elena looked at her daughter. "What are those?" "I don't know," Clara said. She was not looking at the drawing, but at the cabin, her expression thoughtful. They felt like the right thing to put. Elena looked at the drawing for a moment, then at the cabin, then at the clearing where two men had sat and argued and built something over decades of careful work. "Yeah," she said. They did. The first anniversary of the letter's arrival was a Thursday in October, a year to the approximate week from the morning Elena had found the cream envelope taped to her apartment door. She marked it quietly, internally, in the way she had always marked the things that mattered most to her, not with ceremony but with attention. She walked to the foundation's office, 3 blocks from the house. She made coffee from the good machine in the break room, the kind of coffee that was genuinely good, which she had never stopped appreciating. She sat at her desk and opened the numbers. In 1 year, the Whitaker Avila Foundation had provided housing match assistance to 163 families and scholarship support to 47 individuals, most of them in the middle of programs they were completing on schedule. Small business loans to 31 entrepreneurs, 24 of whom were operating profitably. The foundation's total community investment in its first year was $42 million. Elena looked at the number. $42 million in 1 year. Whitaker had grown the estate from its origins over 50 years to $312 million. If the foundation invested and grew its endowment with the same conservative care he had applied, it would be doing this work not just for a decade, but for a generation. For Clara's generation and the one after that. She thought about the voice on the bus a year ago, when she had not yet opened the letter and did not yet know what she was carrying, running the numbers that didn't work, calculating how to make $50 cross a gap that needed 100, the specific arithmetic of a life in which the math was always slightly against you, and the specific exhaustion of running those numbers every single day. She thought about every person whose application she had read, every story that was a variation on the same story, the story of someone who was doing everything right and for whom the math still didn't work, not because of any failure of effort or character or intelligence, but because of the simple structural fact that some lives had cushion and some did not, and the ones that did not were always one bad event away from catastrophe, always carrying more weight with less support, always being asked to do more, with less as though that were simply their nature rather than their circumstance. She thought about what Whitaker had written. I hope she uses it for good work. She thought about what good work looked like from the inside of it. It looked like Adriana Fuentes' daughters having a yard. It looked like the woman in Nashville who reminded Elena of herself, finishing her nursing degree with her child care covered and her rent managed and the specific terror of the math finally, mercifully, addressed. It looked like the 31 business owners who had a plan and a capability and now had the first capital to test both. It looked like Elena, walking 3 blocks to an office in the morning without a security detail or a driver, with nothing but good coffee and work she cared about, and a daughter who was, at this exact moment, in a school where she was known by her teachers as curious and kind and a little bit stubborn, which were exactly the qualities she had always been, and which the last year hadn't changed, but had given room to grow. There was a moment in November when Elena ran into Darnell Price. She had not planned it. She had gone to a grocery store in the neighborhood near the old apartment to pick up something she couldn't find at the store near the house, a specific brand of coffee that she had started on when the budget required it, and had found herself still preferring for reasons she could not entirely explain. Brand loyalty formed under scarcity was a strange and tenacious thing. He was in the coffee aisle. She saw him before he saw her. He had a basket over his arm and was reading the back of something with the distracted expression of a man thinking about something else. He looked exactly the same posture, the same bearing of a person who had learned to occupy space as though it carried authority. Then he looked up and saw her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She had thought about this, on some level, the possibility of this, had wondered what she would feel if it happened. She had expected anger, want or satisfaction, the specific vindictive satisfaction of being seen by someone who had told you what you were worth and being able to demonstrate, tangibly, that he had been wrong. She didn't feel either of those things. What she felt was something closer to pity, and then, even that, faded quickly into something more neutral, the recognition of a person who had played a role in her story, and whose role was now complete. "Hey," he said. Oh, his voice was uncertain in a way it had never been when she worked for him. "Darnell." A silence. "I heard about, the inheritance." He shifted his weight. "That's congratulations." "Thank you." Another silence. He seemed to be working towards something, some formulation, and Elena waited without helping him find it. "The thing I said about the Kentucky property," he started. "I know what you were doing," she said. Not unkindly. Plainly. "It's okay." He looked at her, nor she could see him trying to read what okay meant. She let it remain ambiguous, because the truth of it was more complicated than he needed, that it was okay in the sense that she had moved through it and past it, and that it had, in its way, been useful, had added itself to the long education in what it felt like to be told you didn't belong, and had sharpened her understanding of what the foundation was for and who it needed to serve. She was not going to give him that. It wasn't his. "No, take care of yourself," she said, and went to find her coffee. She did not look back. The cabin restoration was completed in October of the following year. Combs had done meticulous work, as Elena had known from the quality of his assessment that he would. The structure was rebuilt where it had collapsed, the logs matched from reclaimed timber of the same age and species, but the work done carefully enough that the new sections would take years to become indistinguishable from the old, but were structurally sound in a way the original had not been in decades. The porch was restored, the boards replaced where necessary, and the whole structure releveled and secured. The vines had been removed from the south wall, which had turned out to be in better condition beneath them than expected. The stone and mortar intact, the logs behind it solid. The basement was finished as she had asked, stone walls cleaned and sealed, the earthen floor replaced with slate that maintained the temperature of the original. The shelves she had specified installed floor to ceiling along the west wall. She had the bookshelves built in the same configuration as they had been when the metal boxes sat on them, measuring the proportions from the photographs she had taken on her phone that first day with Clara. She filled the shelves with books, Whitaker's books, the ones from the warped shelf in the main room that she had carefully dried and treated and where possible restored. Her grandfather's books, which she had found through a circuitous investigation that eventually produced a box of them from a storage facility in Harlan that a neighbor had maintained after Robert's death and never quite managed to dispose of. Her own books, the ones that had moved from the apartment on Caldwell Street to the West Knoxville house. Books she bought specifically for the space, things that seemed like what the space wanted. The journal she placed in a glass case on the center shelf, not locked, accessible, present. Clara came with her to see the finished space. They went down the stairs together, Clara ahead, her feet certain on the wood that had been solid for a year before Elena had found it, and was solid still. The light in the basement was different now, warmer, the stone walls clean, and the shelves full, and the slate floor cool under their feet. Clara turned slowly in the center of the room. "It's better," she said. "Is it?" "It's still the same place," Clara said. "You can feel that." "But it's better." She looked at the shelves, like it was always supposed to be used. Elena stood in the finished basement of the restored cabin in Harlan County, Kentucky, in the place where James Earl Whitaker had kept careful accounts for 50 years, and thought about what it meant to inherit something. She had inherited a fortune. That was the simple version. The number was $312 million, and the number was real and verified and documented in ways that would withstand any challenge, because Whitaker had built it to last. But she had also inherited a way of seeing, the understanding that worth was not the same as price, that the most important things were often invisible to the people who were looking for the wrong kind of value, that a broken cabin in the mountains could hold something that a clean glass tower could not, that a woman cleaning offices at 4 a.m. could be carrying something no one around her knew to look for. She had inherited patience, the example of it at least. Whitaker's 44 years, her grandfather's 10, before Route 11 had ended his chapter and passed the story on. The patience of people who built things they believed in, not for the immediate reward, but for the eventual arrival at the place where what they had built would matter. She had inherited Clara's presence in that basement on the first day, her daughter's hand over hers on the smallest key. The two of them turning it together. That was the real inheritance. The rest was the evidence of it. She put her hand on the glass case that held Whitaker's journal. She did not have the words she would say to him if she could. She was not someone who talked easily to the absent, but she felt, in the cool, dry air of the basement he had tended, with the shelves he had built still standing, and now holding something new, a gratitude that was too large for words and did not need them. She thought, "I see it. I see what you saw. I'm going to keep seeing it." Clara had found the small iron ring in the floor. She looked up at her mother. "Do you think he always knew we'd come?" Elena thought about the deliberate hand, the label maker, the 44 years. The letter timed to arrive after Patricia died, because Whitaker had been watching and had known that was the moment Elena would be most alone. The key taped inside the envelope's seam, in the place where only someone paying close attention would find it. "Yes," she said. "I think he always knew." Clara nodded, satisfied, the way she was satisfied when a story turned out to make sense at the end. "Good," she said. "That means it was supposed to happen." Elena thought about whether that was true, whether things could be supposed to happen in the way Clara meant, whether the universe organized itself around the narratives we needed. She was not sure she believed it in the abstract, but in the specific, in this basement, in this particular intersection of a grandfather she never knew, and a man who had kept faith for half a century, and a letter arriving on a morning when she had $412 in her checking account and a field trip form on the counter, in her daughter's hand over hers on the first key. In the specific, it was very easy to believe. She took one last look at the space, the shelves, the light, the glass case with the journal, the slate floor, cool and permanent. Then she followed Clara up the stairs, into the restored cabin, through the main room with its fireplace and its broad, clean windows, and out and onto the porch. The October mountain air hit them both at the same moment, cold and clean and full of the smell of leaves turning, the year doing what the year did, the mountain indifferent and beautiful and entirely itself. The clearing was bright in the afternoon light. The trees at the edge of it moved in the wind. Aunt Clara stood on the porch with her hands on the railing and looked out at the clearing and said, without turning around, "Can we stay here sometimes? Like, actually stay? Sleep here and have soup and all that?" Elena looked at the cabin behind them, at the restored porch rails under Clara's hands, at the mountains going up and up in every direction, old and permanent, and entirely unimpressed with the things that had happened at their feet. "Yes," she said, "we can stay." She looked at the place where her grandfather and James Earl Whitaker had sat with bad coffee and argued about numbers and built something that had lasted long enough to reach her. She thought about worth and price and the distance between them. She thought about the women whose applications she would read this week, each one a specific and irreplaceable story, each one someone whose math was about to change. She thought, this is what good work looks like. This is exactly what it looks like. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.